that you will, I hope that you'll take time out of your schedule. I'll say this: if you try to fit in a marriage weekend or on a weekend, it's really probably not going to work. What you need to do is just say, okay, I'm going to either mow the grass on Thursday night, or I'll be honest, I'm not a mow the grass on Sunday guy. I don't want to put everyone's conscience on that thing, but maybe you just mow the grass on Sunday afternoon, all right? Whatever you need to do, but just kind of whatever you need to do with arranging your calendar, your schedule. I just want to encourage you, make the time and effort. What I have found in nearly 10 years of leading a pastoral ministry, 20 years in ministry, is that people who don't need, can I just talk like this, who don't need a marriage weekender, come to marriage weekenders. And people who need a marriage weekender don't come. Does that make sense? And I think you say, is that a correlation or causation issue? I think it's probably a little bit of both. People who say their marriage is strong and they're growing, it's because they take times like this to give attention to their marriage. And so I want to encourage you, men. I'm going to talk to the men. Maybe next week I'll talk to the ladies. So men, if your wife is saying to you, hey, we need to go to this, then, I don't know, hire a teenager to mow your lawn that weekend. Do something to clear your schedule so that you can be here and participate and just have your own life challenged personally, and prioritize that for your family. Okay, I know that's a really hard sell what I just did by saying that, and prioritize it for your family. But I really want to encourage you to give consideration to attending. Here's the thing: is I find that one marriage weekender probably not the one thing. In some people's lives, it can be. It's probably not the one thing, but it's one brick amongst many bricks that is what's helpful for us in growing like that, okay? So just want to bring that to your attention. It's the first weekend of November. Last year, we held it off-site at a location, at a Christian counseling place. They've had major issues with the ice storm and fixing things and repairing things. And so because of the numbers that we had even last year in attendance, this year we'll go on-site here. I'm going to do a little survey that weekend to say, hey, are you guys up to going off-site, like to a weekend retreat type thing in the years to come? But for this year, it'll be here, okay? And so anyways, spend some time online. Judges chapter 8 is where we find ourselves. Lord, thank you for the worship that you've given to us this morning. Now use your word in our lives. Lord, I want to thank you for our men and women who week in and week out give themselves behind the scenes to serving this church. Lord, I pray that you would continue to raise up servants behind the scenes. Lord, encourage your saints with your word this morning. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Each year, high school juniors and seniors across our country, at many high schools at least, are shown a video the weekend of prom. The video goes something like this. It follows the life of two seniors, and in the whole video is warning graduating seniors about the dangers of drinking and driving. It is in the final scene of that video that as the camera pans away or pulls away from the graduation of that local high school, that one of the chairs is open and there's a cap and a gown lying on that chair in remembrance of one of the seniors who did not heed the warnings of their high school. In some instances, some high schools will even bring in a totaled car on the back of a flatbed and leave it out there the week before, or the month before prom, or even homecoming at times to demonstrate, hey, listen, this is what happens when you drink and you drive, right? Judges chapter 8 is one of those books where God is saying to us, I want you to look at what will happen to what could happen to your life if you follow a similar path as Gideon does. It's a reminder to all who read it that this too could become you if you do not heed its warnings. And so, while in Judges 6 and 7, we have found considerable similarities that we have found great hope in. Like, oh man, if God can use someone weak, then he can use me, right? And Judges 8 is in a similar vein, but it's more of a warning vein. That Gideon's life is a cautionary tale for those who begin to take strides spiritually, and somewhere along in life, they begin to fall away. Gideon has never been given a title. We've kind of titled him this, but slowly from Judges 6, 7, and now into 8, General Gideon has now become King Gideon. He's become King Gideon without the title. In fact, at one point, he even will say, I'm not going to rule over you. But this entire chapter is dedicated to a judge turned military hero who has now decided to become royalty and has decided to live his life apparently without God. And so the title of our message this morning is Who Will Be King? The Rise and Fall of Gideon, and more, the fall of Gideon. And in his farewell chapter, as we say goodbye to Gideon and move on to another judge next week, in his farewell chapter, Gideon and Israel will provide for us 5 warnings about what life looks like when God is not king. 5 warnings about what life is like when God is not the king of our lives. The chapter begins this way. After the initial rout of 135,000 or 120,000 Midianites, there's 15,000 Midianite militia or military men that are still on the run. And Gideon and his 300 men are following after them. Gideon calls out for the tribe of Ephraim to help. Gideon's from the tribe of Manasseh. Don't confuse that with Midianites. Gideon is from the tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim is to the further to the south. And they call for the Ephraimites to help. Ephraim comes and helps, and they capture 2 princes of Midian. Their names are Oreb and Zeb. Sounds like characters on Lord of the Rings. And in true Lord of the Rings fashion, the Ephraimites bring back severed heads. Look at chapter 7, verse 30. Chapter 7, I said verse 30, there's only 25. Let's go with verse 25. How's that? And they captured the 2 princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb, so named it those places. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Then the men of Ephraim said this, "What is this that you have done to us, Gideon, not to call us when you fight to go to fight against Midian?" They accused him fiercely. And he goes on to ask them a variety of questions. And what we learn here about Gideon is a smooth talker. He's able to kind of wiggle his way out of this jam, and he says things like this, "What have I done in comparison to you?" Kind of hyper-inflating by complimenting them. He goes on to say, "Your victory is even more impressive than my victory was." He even goes on to compliment them about their horticulture, their farming. He says, "And by the way, you guys even have better grapes of Ephraim than the house of Abiezer." He goes on to talk all this way. So Gideon is quite the diplomat, but here's what it's setting us up here for this, because in just a moment, we're going to see a different side to Gideon. It's like there's this Jekyll and Hyde. Because his diplomatic political speech is going to turn on its head in just a moment for 2 cities of Israel. The question is, why does Gideon not use his smooth talking later on, but he uses his smooth talking here? It's probably something to the effect that Ephraim really was a military might. He only has 300 warriors, and Ephraim probably is ready to go to fight. And so let's kind of de-escalate this situation and talk Ephraim off the ledge. Perhaps that's what's going on here. By the way, this is not the last time Ephraim will rise its head in the book of Judges, and that's important. The tribe of Ephraim, of the 12 tribes, is going to cause problems over and over in the book of Judges. And so these two severed heads of Oreb and Zeb that the Ephraimites bring back are important because there's going to be two names coming up later on in the text. They're important for Gideon to see, and we'll find out why in a moment. But most importantly, here is why this text of Scripture is given to us here, is that Ephraim is fulfilling exactly what God had warned Gideon about. That if I have more than 300 men to defeat the Midianites, what will happen? Israel will say, look at us. Look at what we have done. And we're saying that because Ephraim is upset with Gideon. Why didn't you call us? We could have given you the victory. And Ephraim clearly would have taken the credit for the victory. And therefore, that is why God did not allow this tribe with their military prowess to be invited into the scene, at least in the first chapter. So here is the first warning of what life is like when we choose not to live with God as King. That is this, that when God is King, our desire should be for His glory, not our own. When God is King, our desire should be for His glory, not ours. And in fairness, as we go through the next 4 points over the next few minutes, what you'll find is that, quite frankly, each of the next 4 points could clearly fit under this category. Meaning that at its core, living with God as King in my life means living to make His name known. It means living to pursue His mission, not a mission of my own choosing for my own name's sake. That I'm choosing to leverage our lives for God's fame. Right? This goes to the motivation of why we do what we do. Do you want to pursue the best of your career for your glory or for God's glory? There's nothing wrong with being the best in your field, but what is the motivation behind it? And there's nothing wrong with wanting to raise kids that honor and love Jesus, but what is the motivation behind it? There's nothing wrong with having a healthy marriage where love is at the center and the core of it, and there's communication and there's genuine friendship. But why do you want that? What's at the core of it? Why do you pursue what you pursue? That is, when God is King, our desire should be for His glory. And God's glory needs to be spread in every field of employment. It's not that one field of employment is more godly than another. So whether it's education or whether it's engineering or whether it's whatever field it may be, when God is King, our desire should be for His glory. Let me show you a map of what's happening here. Oh man, this is really tiny print here. I'm sorry. Well, there's Ephraim there. And this is Manasseh here. This would be the tribe, and there's East Manasseh up there, and this is West Manasseh. This is where Gideon was from. The battle that had just taken place where they had blown their trumpets or their ram's horns was somewhere up in here. And so they cross over, and I thought I would be able to see this with my glasses, and I can't even see it with my glasses. So I'm going to guess here, but I shouldn't have even told you that because you would never know if I'm guessing. But I'm thinking that this is, I don't know, Succoth and Penuel. Succoth is up here, I believe, and Penuel's down here. So they're going into this area in just a moment. Gideon's going to go into this area, and then he's going to come down into this area, and he's looking for these two kings. But he's crossing the Jordan River, okay? From West Manasseh into Gad, he's crossing over the Jordan River. And Gideon is crossing Jordan, and he's pursuing these two kings by the name of Zebah and Zalmunna, right? Again, great characters for a Lord of the Rings sequel. These are the kings of Midian, and he and the 300 come to two Jewish towns by the name of Succoth and Penuel. And he's asking them for food, right? He's been pursuing them. The text says he was exhausted yet pursuing. And both times, as they enter these two towns, Gideon and his men are not well received at all. The question is, why are they not well received? Perhaps because these two towns are on the other side of the Jordan River, these two towns were fearful of showing too much loyalty to Gideon, and if they were to do that, then the Midianites would still come back and wipe them out. I don't know. That's an option. But whatever the reason was, they weren't very helpful to Gideon. And so now Gideon, the politician, has now turned into Gideon the general, the military leader, and he says things like this. He responds to one city and he says, "When I will return, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." It's the same language when that angel first came to Gideon and he saw Gideon taking and threshing the wheat. He uses that same language. "I'm just like I thresh wheat, I'm going to thresh your backs," is the idea. To the other city in Penuel, when they respond to him saying, "Hey, unless you can show us the hands of these two kings, we aren't going to help you." He responds to them and he says, "Listen, I'm going to come back in peace," is what he says, "but I'm going to tear down your tower." And then we learn what is at the heart of why Gideon is so insistent on going after these two kings. Because when Oreb and Zeeb's heads were held in the hands of Ephraim, Gideon looked at him and said, "No, that's not who I'm looking for." Because in verse 18, Gideon shows us why he is in such hot pursuit. Look at Judges chapter 8, verse 18. He finds them finally. He says to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." And look what Gideon says in verse 19. "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." And then he commands his oldest son, his firstborn, Jether, to rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a young man. And Zebah and Zalmunna challenged Gideon and say, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as a man is, so is his strength." And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna. He takes the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. These two kings, in their looting and their pillaging of Israel year after year, at some point came into conflict with Gideon's brothers. Gideon says, "Hey, what happened to the men at Tabor?" And their response is, "Well, as you are, they're like sons of the king too, but they're no more." And so what was driving Gideon was this internal rage to repudiate Zebah and Zalmunna and to go conquer them and kill them for what they had done to his brothers. And like a king would, Gideon orders his eldest son. There's just little bits of crumbs throughout the text saying that Gideon is starting to act and think like a king, and he orders his oldest son to go and kill them. And so let me give you two more quick signs of what life is like, or warning signs, what life is like when God is not our king. The second one would be this: when God is king, our service is about his agenda, not ours. Somewhere along the line, right, and this line is very narrow, it's very thin, and sometimes it's very faint. Somewhere along the line, Gideon began to believe the mantra, "A sword for the Lord, and for Gideon." A sword for the Lord, and for Gideon. That his God-ordained role as a judge in Israel, as a deliverer in Israel, had turned it into an opportunity to exact personal revenge. His God-given duty had morphed into pursuing his own agenda and even setting up his own personal kingdom with Gideon at the top, where Gideon is king. So we would say, when God is king, our service is about his agenda. The second quick observation and warning sign here is this, is that when God is king, our leadership serves others, not abuses. Our leadership is to serve others, not abuse. And I say that for this reason, that Gideon's behavior toward the two Jewish towns, what is Gideon? He is a deliverer for God's people. And yet his behavior towards 2 Jewish towns is appalling. The role of a judge was to be a deliverer for Israel, not a destroyer of Israel. He was to serve as a liberator, not an oppressor. Let's be honest, Grace Life, we live in a world where leadership is viewed as suspect. Every time we turn, leadership, we see things that are suspect, or someone is causing us to call leadership into suspect. And often it's true because positions of leadership have been used to further one's own agendas, to ingratiate, to enrich at the cause, at the hurt of other people. What Gideon is reminding of us negatively is this, is that when we live as God, as a king in our lives, we are to model servant leadership. He actually uses language in here where in verse 16, he took the elders of the city, he took the thorns in the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth a lesson. Verse 17, and when he broke down the tower of Penuel, and then he goes one step further, he kills the men of the city. Gideon had taken his leadership and abused it. He's acting more like a Canaanite king than a Jewish deliverer. That when God is king, our leadership is intended to serve others, not abuse others. Because of Gideon's victory, Israel then responds with this victory. Israel responds with, "Hey, rule over us. You're the mighty king. You're the mighty deliverer. Become our king." And here's what I want you to catch, that Gideon will reject the kingship with his words, and yet he embraces the role with his actions. Look at verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you." He's given a theological truth next. "The Lord will rule over you." But watch how Gideon now changes his actions. Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil," for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw it in the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and beside the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Did you see in verse 22 where they say to Israel, or they say to Gideon, "You have saved us from the hand of Midian"? That is in direct opposition to what the author of Judges has been saying now for about 3 chapters. I want you to look at this. Look at chapter 7, verse 2. In chapter 7, verse 2, it says this, "The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me." Look at chapter 7, verse 2. Look at verse 7. In verse 7, it reads this way, "And the Lord said to Gideon with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand." Drop down to verse 22 of chapter 7, where it reads this way, "When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against his army." So that in chapter 8, verse 22, when the people of Israel say to Gideon, "You have saved us," what Gideon should have been saying right there is, "No, I did not save you. Yahweh saved you." Gideon has now taken the crescent ornaments from the 2 kings of Midian's, their camels' necks. He's taken their purple garments. Gideon has received 43 pounds of gold. And like Aaron, who asked for Israel's gold to make a golden calf, right, in which all of Israel will rise up and worship that golden calf, Gideon asked for Israel's gold. Why? To make a high priest's ephod. What is an ephod? Here's a picture of one. It is that square centerpiece here that the priest is wearing. There's 12 stones on this. Each one of those stones is representing one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Priests were the primary individuals who would wear the ephod. You could be in another role and still wear an ephod. The ephod was worn by a priest of Aaron. Samuel will wear a priest. He's a prophet. Even David, who's a king, will wear the ephod from time to time. So it's not that somehow him wearing the ephod is somehow a big deal in and of itself, as he is the one who is receiving revelation from God. But the idea is this, is that the ephod was the center of which how God communicated to his prophets, to his priests, and to his kings. And oftentimes, leaders would wear it when they needed wisdom from the Lord. And so if you were the one who carried the ephod, who wore the ephod, what you were communicating was this, is I am the one with the revelation from God. So much so that the prophet Hosea will record as an act of judgment on the nation of Israel. In Hosea chapter 3, verse 4, Hosea will say, the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. The idea there is this, is that when God's judgment comes, it's going to come in such a way that I will remove the ephod, because I will not give my communication, I will not give my revelation to a disobedient people. And Gideon is making his own ephod as a way of symbolizing, as a way of kind of holding up his hands to say, God is still with me. I will be the one who will give you the divine revelation from God. But he places it in his hometown. He doesn't place it in Jerusalem where God has commanded. He doesn't place it in other where the temple would have been, or where the temple would have been. He places it in Ophrah, his hometown, thus making himself the self-appointed ruler and priest of Israel. Gideon is crafting a kingdom where he himself has ultimate authority. This leads us then to the next warning that God gives us, and that is this: when God is king, our actions ought match biblical truth, not contradict it. And brothers and sisters, won't this be the struggle till the day we die? Will it not be our struggle until the day we die, that when we make God our king, that our actions are going to match biblical truth, not contradict it? This isn't brand new news to us. The daily struggle we have as followers of Jesus is this: who will be king in my life? Is Jesus king? Is Joel king? Is someone's other opinion of Joel king? Or is Jesus king? We could say things like this: in my marriage, who will have kingly authority over me? As I raise my kids, who has kingly authority over us? As I manage my finances, will God have a kingly right over me? In our sexuality, will I allow God to reign supreme? In my relational conflicts, will I truly love as I have been loved? In our church, does God have kingly power, authority to tell us what to do, how to do it, and to what extent to do it? These are the questions that are at the core for a person who's thinking to themselves, yeah, God is my king. I'm not king of my life. But then they go on to demonstrate the 15 ways in which really, in reality, no, they really are the king. They just haven't taken the title. But all the entrapments, the gold, the purple robes, the crescents around the camels' necks, all of that have been a part of the entrapments of what it means to be a king in Gideon's day. And the final warning of what life is like when we choose not to make God king is found in verse 27. Where we read this. Verse 27, it says, and all Israel whored after it, there, the ephod, and became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel. They raised their heads no more. And the land had rest 40 years in Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, that's Gideon, by the way, went and, my translation says lived. An equally acceptable translation would be there, to sit. The idea is there of kind of it's a kingly verb that's used of other kings throughout the Old Testament, to sit in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son. He called his name Abimelech, and Gideon the son of Joash died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. The final warning is simply this, is that when God is king, our lives challenge the next generation to follow God. I say challenge because it is not an insurance policy. It's not a for sure, but it's an authentic that someone would have to kind of run over that speed bump going 50 miles an hour to say, no, that's not the God that I'm going to serve. Peace for 40 years for Gideon and for the nation of Israel came at a cost. Gideon's actions, actually, this judge who was to deliver them from the Midianites and the gods of the Midianites, that his actions actually caused Israel to become a spiritual harlot, to worship a false god created by his own hands. In Gideon's day, their worship had become syncretistic. That is, they worshiped Yahweh, but it just so happened to be that Gideon was the divine who was passing off the communication. I know that their worship was syncretistic because as soon as Gideon dies, it says that Israel completely turns away from the Lord, right? They start worshiping the Baals, and they made Baal-berith their god. Is it not interesting? The word Baal is God, berith is covenant. They had a covenant God. His name was Yahweh, but they chose to enter into a new covenant with the god of the Canaanites, Baal-berith. They completely turn away from the Lord, and while Gideon denied that he wanted to be king, he acts like a king in every way. He's got 70 sons because he's got multiple wives. He's got a concubine, which is kind of a public mistress, a second-tier wife, if you will, and he names her son Abimelech, which means this, king of a son, or son of a king. This final chapter of Gideon's life, then, brothers and sisters, is a reminder that we can start well and finish poorly. I want to say this to you. This is not recorded to scare you into obedience, like, oh boy, or that's why this is happening. Brothers and sisters, first of all, that's not how your God works. So it's not intended to scare you into obedience, but it is a startling reminder that even those commended for their faith, and let's be honest, Gideon is still commended for his faith in Hebrews chapter 11. That even those who are commended for their faith can falter and fail. Israel is revealing to us that even in victory, Israel is still their own worst enemy. Their worst enemy was not Midian, their worst enemy was themselves. Brothers and sisters, our worst enemies are not culture wars. Our worst enemies are not other religions. Our worst enemies on our best days are ourselves, our own hearts. And what Gideon is telling us is that as soon as we're on the mountaintop, we're ready to go into the valley. And that depending on who we make king is the reality of who is going to walk beside us. Saints, our flesh is strong, right? The spirit is willing, but it is weak. Let it be clear that God says in Isaiah chapter 42, I am the Lord. That is my name. My glory, I will not give it to any other. And so we can build edifices and we can build buildings and structures and programs and say, wow, look at what we have done, and in the end, it will burn. The only thing that will stand at the end of time is the glory of God and His people who give Him glory. See, brothers and sisters, when we talk about the kingdom of God around here, we're not just talking about some future event. It is also a spiritual reality here and now. And daily we are having to ask ourselves, how will Jesus be king in my life? So I guess a good application question while you're driving home, or maybe it's just you and your spouse, or when you're eating lunch with some other family this afternoon, is say, what would it look like if Jesus were king in my life? Would be an appropriate question to ask. And so I want to